Thank you for watching our presentation, Psychological Conditions and Remediation. This presentation is primarily geared for project managers and restoration company management and owners. Now, if you haven't yet downloaded the worksheet quiz that goes with this presentation, I strongly suggest you press pause and go to our blog at microscopicminute.com. Again, microscopicminute.com. For those of you who don't know who we are, Environmental Initiatives is an indoor environmental testing company. We assess buildings for water damage and moisture, sewage losses, air quality, odors. We do smoke assessments. Many of our sampling types are analyzed on site using a microscope or other devices. So we can tell a person in real time where the contaminants went, what needs to be done. For example, in a fire loss, we can, within hours, tell you where the smoke traveled through a building, which surfaces were hit, where the smoke impacted, and likely what level of cleaning is going to be necessary. For myself, I've been doing this sort of work since 2003. My background is in microbiology, immunology, and chemistry. My thesis work was on water damaged buildings and how that impacts health. So what's the end goal of remediation? Initially you probably think that the end goal is to create a space that is a pre-loss condition, or to remove contaminants or address the condition. But is the goal of remediation also to make the person feel good about their environment? Because adequately cleaning a space and adequately addressing the emotional impact of a space and how a person feels about it can be two very separate tasks. And oftentimes remediation contractors and consultants like myself are less adept or less trained to address the psychological portion of what they're doing. So that's really the goal of this presentation, to talk about certain psychological conditions or issues or disorders that you may recognize ahead of time in your potential clients, which may then tailor how you work with that person or conduct the project. During this presentation, we're going to first talk a little bit about hypersensitivities versus psychological issues. Then we'll discuss the commonly encountered issues. Then we will be talking about precautions and considerations that you may want to take if you suspect your client may have a psychological issue. And for questions and answers, you can either ask your questions in the comment section below, or you can call or email me. My contact information is going to be towards the end of this presentation. So you go out to a site and a person says that they're having symptoms, but you can't seem to find anything. You might be considering that the person has a psychological issue, but before you do that, you better be very sure that the person simply isn't hypersensitive and is reacting to concentrations of contaminants that we normally don't consider, or maybe they're reacting to types of contaminants that we normally don't test for. All right, so if a person calls and they're reporting symptoms, it's going to fall in one of four categories. The situation is either one, there is no psychological influence, and the symptoms are all from the environment and they all make sense. Two, there are psychological influences going on, but there really is an issue and the environmental impact is causing the symptoms. Or three, there's a psychological issue and it might be actually caused by the environment. So there are situations where people have issues with inflammation in their body from exposure to certain building contaminants, and that can change their brain chemistry, essentially. And so there are things like anxiety, depression, and whatnot that can be worsened by exposure to certain contaminants. Or number four, and this is the hardest to help with, you suspect that the situation is potentially completely psychological and there is no environmental issue. You might have gone there, you might not find anything, and you're not sure what to do or how to help the person. Now, let's say you're dealing with a group of people. when you're trying to figure out if people who are describing symptoms, if it's potentially because they're hypersensitive or if there's a psychological issue, when there's more people present, you can start to use statistics. If more than 50% of people in a space, and let's say there's 10 people or more, right? So you actually have a number of people to work with. Let's say more than 50% of 10 people are describing the symptoms, usually the issue is going to be from some sort of irritant or chemical, like combustion products, which is the gases that come off of furnaces or water heaters or anything where you burn natural gas. Maybe there's chemical releases, maybe there's too much dust, or maybe there's a very irritating dust, like fiberglass in the dust. So usually more than 50% of people describing symptoms are going to be thinking about chemicals or particles. Now, if 25 to 50% of people are describing symptoms, then you still think it's probably some sort of irritant, chemicals or particles. But then you start to think about potential group dynamics or social issues. Is it a situation where, there's 10 people in this office, but the 3 people who are describing symptoms or the 4 people describing symptoms are all in one section, and you can't find anything interesting with that section. But they're talkers. One person says, "Oh man, I get a headache when I'm here," and then pretty soon other people are like, "Yeah, I think I get headaches here too." Well, that does happen. We call that group dynamics. Now, if you're working with a smaller percentage of people who are describing symptoms, it could still be group dynamics. But then we start to think about allergies. 1 out of 4 people has an allergy, whether it's the cats or dogs. So when you start to hit 25% or less, you start to think, is it dampness and mold? Is it dust mites? Is it cockroaches? Allergens are a strong play in that range of percentage. But then let's say you're working with just 1 or 2 people out of many who are describing symptoms. Oftentimes, unfortunately, their coworkers or their bosses might think that they're just a complainer, that there's nothing wrong and it's them and not the building. And you know what? Sometimes they're right. Sometimes it is a psychological issue or psychosomatic symptoms. But oftentimes it's also because of hypersensitivity. So just because everyone around the person is saying they're not really sick, don't assume they're not really sick. They might actually have an extreme allergy to something, like maybe a pet dander and the neighboring cubicle is a pet owner. Or they're allergic to a very specific type of chemical that's being used by the janitorial staff. So always make sure you rule out even random environmental issues before you consider that somebody's having a psychological disorder and you decide to not help or do nothing about the situation. All right, so who are these hypersensitive people? So before you suggest that a person is having a psychological disorder, you better damn well be sure that they're not simply hypersensitive. People who are often more hypersensitive to their environments, it's usually because of their immune system or their nervous system. So usually these people will also have allergies or asthma, or they'll be immunocompromised, HIV, AIDS, chemotherapy, or they'll have an autoimmune disease like rheumatoid arthritis, inflammatory bowel disease, Crohn's disease. Sometimes it's hard to ask these people these questions, but I do, and I suggest you do as well. You can say, "Look, Mrs. Jones, you don't need to tell me details or anything like that, but do you have any autoimmune diseases? Because that can make you more hypersensitive." Or maybe they have chemical sensitivities. You might ask them questions like, "Do you react to colognes and perfumes? Does pumping gasoline, is that hard on you?" Because those are people who can be far more hypersensitive to their environment and react to situations other people don't react to. But there's also psychological conditions, which makes this all very difficult because certain psychological conditions are occurring because a person is overreacting to their environment. But you have to think about these sensitivities, talk to the person, know the person, if you don't find items in the environment that are easy to identify and to work on. Now we're going to discuss the more common psychological disorders that we work with in this industry. We're going to talk about the individual disorders in a minute. Now, the most common disorders that we experience or encounter in this industry is somatization disorder. That's where people believe they're getting sick because of an exposure. Hypochondriasis, where a person is concerned that they may get sick. So they don't think they are, they're concerned that they may. These are the hypochondriacs. Obsessive-Compulsive disorder, OCD. Panic and anxiety disorders. Major depression disorder. Bipolar depression disorder. And various psychotic disorders, and we'll describe what these all mean. So first with somatization disorder, these people are not hypochondriacs. Again, somaticizers are people who have recurrent or chronic symptoms or complaints about symptoms, but they don't seem to have a biological trigger, right? So they believe that they're being sickened by their house, perhaps, and they think it might be the water damage, but in the end, they don't know, or maybe it has nothing to do with their environment, or it wouldn't have anything to do with their environment. Often these people will change doctors, and they will often describe that too. So basically they go from one doctor to the next, and people aren't able to tell them what's wrong, or they don't believe them. It's pretty rare, about 1% of women, less than 1% of men, but oddly enough, when you really think about it, we deal with more than 1% of our clientele who match this disorder. All right, so what are some clues? You get a phone call, you do a site visit to do an estimate. First off, somaticizers will often have very long, detailed histories to support their beliefs. Many times, these are the people who will pull out the notebook and they'll have pages and pages of notes. Some of the notes are highlighted or circled, and they'll go back and forth through their notebook telling you what's all happened to make sure you believe what they're telling you. Often they'll take a lot of medications. Why? Because they go to see a lot of doctors, and the doctors are like, I don't know, try this. The next doctor goes, I don't know, try this. Now, I don't purposely snoop around people's houses, right? But I'm a consultant. I am paid to go around people's houses and assess their buildings. While I'm doing that, I'm not opening drawers, but you better believe I'm looking at their countertops, I'm looking at their nightstands, I'm looking in their bathrooms to kind of see what kind of medications are present. Do I walk in their bedroom and there's just loads of empty pill bottles or half-filled pill bottles? Now, it doesn't mean that they're a somaticizer, but it's a clue that they might be. Usually they have difficulties in social relationships. So often they'll be divorced, single. You'll notice, they might have discussions about how their children no longer help them. And they will have usually, but not always, a self-centered attitude. Sometimes when I'm working with someone who I think might be a somaticizer, they'll go on and on and on the phone or in person. And I'll try to veer the conversation with a question. Many times somaticizers don't let the conversation veer. So I might ask something, but they'll keep barreling on with their train of thought. Now, some people are just self-centered, and they're not somaticizers. But this is a clue. They're often very excitable, so the conversation goes up and down in intensity. And they'll often they'll present their symptoms with gusto. So I wake up stiff as a board. I'm walking on pins and needles. It's like a knife is stabbing into my back. Now, I think the reason why they use this gusto is to help paint the picture and help you buy into their story. Because what they're trying to do is convince you that they have a problem and not to think that they're a somaticizer so that you find out what's wrong with them. To say a few things about hypochondriacs. Hypochondriacs have the fear that they have a serious illness or that they're being sickened by their environment or could be sickened. Although they don't have any symptoms to point to, it's that nagging fear that they're addressing. Many times these people will call because they have the fear that their children or someone that they love or a relative is being exposed in their environment. The difference between somaticizers and hypochondriacs. Somatizers will tell you very specific symptoms they've been getting and will then say it must be because of this, while hypochondriacs are saying, look, I believe I'm being exposed to this and I'm worried that it's affecting me, but they don't have any specific symptoms to describe. So what are some clues? You get a phone call, you go on site. First off, the person's going to describe a lot of fear on the phone. In fact, they'll even use the word fear. They'll say, Mike, I just fear that this water damage is causing me health problems. I'm worried that I read about things like that, not I have. They'll often have very long conversations about what other sources say. Of course, in the age of the internet, they'll tell you what they read on WebMD or what they read or heard on these other sites, which really sucks because we all know there's a lot of websites of contractors and consultants that spread a lot of fear. So they'll believe that whatever they read must be the gospel truth. Often, you know what, they'll just tell you. And I actually kind of like working with hypochondriacs because they usually know it. And when someone says, I'm just a hypochondriac, I know we all say that once in a while as a joke. But you know what? Sometimes people, when they say it, they're very serious and they know what their issues are. But the hypochondriacs usually are pretty easy to help. You have to act confidently. You explain yourself reasonably, and you cite some sources. And usually I get hypochondriacs to accept an indoor environment. Now often they'll just go on to fear or worry about something else, but that's not my problem. My job is to make sure they're okay with their current situation with their indoor environment. The most common type of disorder that we encounter in the environmental consulting and the remediation worlds are anxiety disorders, which makes sense because anxiety disorders are the most common pervasive of the mental disorders. They're so common that 18% of people experience an anxiety disorder in any given year. Sometimes it's very noticeable and it completely impacts your life. Other times you don't realize it until weeks later how you've been feeling because you start to feel differently. The anxiety disorders that we most often talk about, major depressive disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, and panic disorder. However, in the environmental consulting world, the ones that I believe I'm encountering the most is generalized anxiety disorder and occasionally panic disorder. So you're either taking the phone call of a person or you're going out to a site and you're not seeing as much damage as you expected to based on their emotional reaction to it. And you're starting to wonder if this person might have an anxiety disorder. So what are some clues we're looking for? Oftentimes people with anxiety disorder are hypervigilant. They're always looking for the next threat on the horizon. And that often relates to them having physical manifestations of that. They'll literally be looking around often, darting their eyes, just being very wary of the environment. They're often easily startled, and it has to do with their nervous system. So like if you shut a door too hard or drop an item and it makes a noise, you'll see them have an exaggerated jump response. They'll have overactivation of the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system is the nervous system that will regulate all the things that we don't consciously think about. So digestion, perspiration, those types of items. So often this means people with overactivated autonomic nervous system will often have excessive sweating, dizziness. So you'll often see people holding on to walls or to tables or other surfaces when they're talking to you. Yeah, sometimes they're just leaning against these surfaces, but if you notice they're doing it all the time, it might actually be because they're dizzy. They'll often have cold and clammy hands. Now, I always shake hands when I first meet somebody and then when I'm all done, and part of it's to be polite, but really part of it is to see, are their hands cold and clammy? Are they shaking? Are they vibrating? How does it feel? They'll often have a pounding heart, which sometimes you can hear. So if you're standing close to them, you can hear thump, 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 thump from that nervous system overreacting. And there'll often be frequent urination. So while you're there doing your estimate, if you notice within that 40-minute span that they've gone to the bathroom twice, well, hell, maybe it's just their day. But it's also a clue that maybe they're having frequent urination from an anxiety disorder. And they'll often repeatedly ask the same question with slight variations or slight alterations. So they'll ask you, well, what are you going to do with this floor? Later on, they'll say, so you're going to do what with this floor? Okay, you're going to do something with this floor. What was it? And they'll have to get reassurance about the same type of item over and over again. Another type of disorder that I actually don't run into much is obsessive-compulsive disorder. Or at least I don't run into the types of obsessive-compulsive disorders that are directly potentially impacting the situation. Obsessive-compulsive or OCD, it's recurring thoughts, images, or impulses. So it might be that somebody's recurrently thinking about something, or there's an intrusive thought that keeps showing in their head, or they have to physically do something over and over again. There's many types of OCD, and there's different degrees of OCD. So many people have OCD at a very low level. A type of OCD that's common is called checking. Basically, let's say you're going to leave the house, and you check the oven 10 times to make sure it's actually off. Or maybe you check all the lights multiple times to make sure they're off. There's contamination. You're worried that a surface is contaminated, so it has to be cleaned repeatedly to keep it from being contaminated. Or mental contamination. Sometimes this is religious fervor, where you believe that mentally you're uncontaminated or that your thoughts are going to impact people. Hoarding. Sometimes it's that you're afraid to get rid of things because you might need them. Sometimes you're afraid to get rid of things because you're worried on how that thing feels. Like you're going to hurt the chair's feelings if you get rid of it. Other times you hoard things because you're afraid that those things are going to hurt other people. So you might hoard broken glass because you're afraid to put it in a dump because somebody might step on it. Ruminations, that's where you think about something. Ruminations is different than intrusive thoughts. Intrusive thoughts is where you can't help but think about something. Ruminations is where you're purposely thinking about something and you're really digging into it over and over again, thinking about all the different variations of how you can think about it. So, obsessive-compulsive clues. OCD people will frequently, repeatedly call you or email to make sure that the schedule is accurate. Hey, this is Mike. I'm just making sure 3 o'clock Thursday. I just want to make sure it's still on. When they do that more than once, you start to think maybe they have OCD. Or when you go into their place, you see evidence of hoarding. Maybe they have lots of trinkets. Maybe they have flat out garbage everywhere. It's easy to think that a person who has a lot of garbage is simply lazy or depressed, and sometimes those things do cause a lot of garbage buildup. But if you start to see a lot of garbage buildup, you do need to start thinking OCD, and then you may change how you do the project because of that. Again, repeated questions during the project, or they have the same questions about details of the contract. They want to make sure everything is in order, and they ask you the same question multiple times. Sometimes they vary it. They'll ask for surfaces to be re-cleaned. That physical contamination issue. So they'll say, look, I just don't think this floor is good enough, or I did it myself with the vinegar and I think you can do it better because I still got something on my rag. All right, so psychotic disorders are the most difficult for us to address, both as a consultant and as a contractor. A psychotic disorder, a person has their perceptions or their thoughts or their consciousness altered. So they take in a stimulus and their brain perceives it in a totally new or false way. We'll often call these alterations delusions or hallucinations, and when we think about hallucinations, we often think about schizophrenia, which is definitely a psychotic disorder. However, we almost never deal with people with schizophrenia because that level of disorder is usually too intense for a person to continue to, be a manager at a business, to hire a company, or to own a house oftentimes. Some psychotic or some examples of delusions that we do encounter, at least as a consultant, I encounter these rather frequently. One is persecutory. This is where a person believes that like their neighbor or their friend or their family member is trying to harm them. And sometimes it's that they think that there's poisons in the house that they have to be found. Or sometimes they think the house is trying to poison them for some reason. Normally, if I am doing a phone interview with someone and I realize they're having persecutory delusions, I almost never go out to the site. If I can tell that a person has a psychotic disorder ahead of time, I normally don't take the project because it's very hard to convince somebody that they might be wrong. Somatic delusions, that's where someone is convinced that there's something wrong with them. This is very much like somaticizers, where they think they're getting sick. And then induced delusional disorder is interesting. This is where two people, or at least one person, is very isolated from the rest of the world, and the person with the more forceful personality will force upon or induce their own delusion on the other person. We see this once in a while, usually with elderly couples, where one person is likely having a delusion, and over time the other person's like, yeah, and after a while I realized they were right. The husband or the wife might say that, and it's because of induced delusions. One person has the delusion and they have a more forceful personality, and over time the other person starts to believe them. So to go back to the question I asked early in the presentation, what's the goal of remediation? Is it to focus on the house or the building, get it back to a pre-loss condition, remove the contaminants? Or is the goal also to make the person feel comfortable with the work that was completed? If your definition is to also make the person feel comfortable with the work that's completed, well, then you need to determine if they have a disorder of some type and how you might need to address documentation or final evidence or proof to help the person feel comfortable with that work. But the basic goals, right? The basic goals of water damage remediation. These basic goals are, one, when you're doing your work, right, you want to separate your work from the other areas so you lessen the cross-contamination. Then you want to document what steps you took to stop that cross-contamination. Then you have to dry the materials, right? Make sure the space won't grow more stuff. And document that you have dry surfaces and materials. Then you have to do the cleaning. You have to significantly reduce the contaminants through physical cleaning, through air filtration. And then oftentimes you'll want to document that. It might be through pictures. It might be through testing, whether you do some sort of internal testing or you hire someone like us to do the testing. So what we want to do additionally for clients that may have psychological concerns is you're going to overly communicate before the project starts. You're going to clearly make sure they repeat to you what you're doing and how you're doing it so there's no miscommunication from the get-go. You're going to then overly document lots more pictures, more notes about what happened each day. Take your notes real time. You're going to do things to your containment to make sure you don't have cross-contamination or the appearance that cross-contamination could have occurred. So for all your entrances, for your containment, you're going to double flap and zipper them. You're going to potentially depressurize areas even if it's a type of project where you wouldn't have depressurized in the first place. And you're going to try to deodorize without odor additives if odor is present. What that means is that if you do have an odor that you're also trying to address, like a musty odor, you're not going to do things like adding fragrance, like flower fragrance or citrus. You're going to try to do deodorization tactics like heating and ventilating, maybe hydroxyl, never ozone for this case. So you get rid of as much odor as possible without adding other scents. Now the reason I say this is because you don't want a potentially delusional person to go in, smell the odor, and then think that there's something else going on, or anxiety issues, things like that. So you want it to be as deodorized as possible. And consider post-remediation verification. If you're concerned that the person might not accept your job or months later might say you did a bad job, you can hire someone like us to come out and objectively determine if the job was well done. Pictures, moisture measurements, microscope testing. And if we want some more work done, we'll tell you and we'll come back out and retest. All right, thank you very much for watching the presentation. Like I said, hopefully you had downloaded our worksheet, which is at microscopicminute.com. Now, if you have any questions regarding psychological issues and projects or other types of questions, please email me or call me. My information is on this site. Thank you very much.